you might just stick in the room because we have the first mover advantage, but hopefully everybody's in the right place. So we have 5 really nice papers to listen to this in this session. And I discussed this with the speakers in terms of how to manage the Q&A. And given the way in which I've been teaching with Zoom, that a lot of people put a lot more questions in the chat rather than verbally, what I would like to encourage all the participants to do is, if you have a question, put it in the chat and write first at whom the question is addressed. So, you know, if you want to ask a question to Konstantinos and Mario, you say at Konstantinos and Mario and put your question there. This way we will have all 5 presentations first. And then the speakers, once they're done speaking, they can look at the chat and pick the questions that they can then answer afterwards. And I'll give the floor back to each speaker at the end of the session so that each of them can then elaborate on the questions that have been asked. I think this might be a bit fair so everybody gets enough time to, or roughly equal time to respond to the questions. I hope that's clear for everybody. So all the speakers already are co-hosts, so you should be able to open up your slides if you wish to do so. So I'd like to invite Mario and Konstantinos first to present.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, that's good. Hi everyone. My name is Konstantinos. I can see Marios is also there. Marios, everything all right on your end, technically speaking?
Yes.
Okay.
So
good.
far.
Giorgio, thank you very much for opening this this panel, and to Michal as well, who is not here. I'm speaking to you from still lockdown in Leeds, United Kingdom, and it really is fantastic that we managed to put this together. It really is a shame that I am in Leeds and not in Porto, but we have to do with. Sorry, what? Okay. No worries. I heard something. So thank you for coming to this panel. It's quite an interesting and ongoing discussion about what the goals and purposes of EU competition law, or generally competition law, are. So Marios and I will kick it off with a preliminary results of a study that we've been working on for about a year now, and which has been funded by the Swedish competition authority very generously. So a big shout out to them as well. And the way we're going to do it is that I am going to try to share my screen and change the slides so that everybody can follow the presentation. And Marios and I will alternate taking turns speaking. And then Marios, unfortunately, because he's very popular, he's going to have to go and present in another panel. So I'll try to answer your questions or relay them back to Marios. And with that, I'll try to do the share screen thing. I will share this window. Share. And can someone tell me if you are seeing a PowerPoint presentation?
We can see the slides.
Okay,
yeah.
good.
Just use a presenter, what you call it, full screen.
Yes, okay.
All right, so as Konstantinos was saying, we're sort of going to present to you the preliminary results of a comprehensive empirical investigation into the goals of EU competition law. Actually, a project that was born in Ascola 2017, I think, in Stockholm. And now, after a year of research, we are more or less ready to present the results and also write the report. Next. So our aim with the project has been to demonstrate comprehensively what courts and the Commission think the goals of EU competition law are, and try to get a clear picture. Because we observe that many times in the relevant literature, people tend to focus on 1 or 2 or let's say 10 hit cases, but then forget that all cases in EU competition law are born equal. So that we wanted to sort of look at the whole corpus of case law. And the idea is to present the data in a way which is easily comprehensible in data, and discuss how the chosen goals are used to inform the outcomes of cases. The idea is to try to identify quantitative and qualitative differences between types of sources, but also between different goals that EU competition law might be pursuing. And one of our deliverables beyond the report will be to provide a novel and unique open source data set that other researchers can scrutinize, if they want to criticize our method, but also use in order to find cases that relate to a particular goal they're investigating, but also replicate to do it in a different jurisdiction, or expand it, or continue doing it from 2020 and onwards, because our project is now more or less complete. Next, yeah. So our research questions are roughly in a popular way for a conference. Are the different goals indeed invoked as relevant goals of EU competition law? If so, in which type of sources, how often, and does the frequency fluctuate? Historically, can we see any trends, basically? Also, in what way are the goals used? Are they simply obiter dicta? Is it simply the court or the commission quoting black letter law? Or do they play a decisive role in the analysis? And also within each type of source, can we see any further divisions? For example, depending on the type of case, so whether it's an agreement, it's a one-on-one case, a one-on-two case, or a concentration, but also between different sources. So whether it's the General Court or the Court of Justice, if it's the Court of Justice versus the AGs, or the court versus the commission. And of course, hopefully that also guides sort of the future, so you can see trends from the past and try to extrapolate what might happen in the future. And of course, also we wanted to see whether the fairness discussion trend has been something that is exaggerated in competition law circles, or whether this is reflected in the actual decisional practice and the case law.
Thank you, Marius. So we promised a comprehensive investigation, and comprehensive it was. We decided to go through pretty much the entire case law of the Court of Justice, including the General Court and the Court of Justice. We also cataloged the Commission decisions, which was not fun or easy. As you know, unfortunately, the Commission decisions are not searchable by keyword, by full text. So it was impossible to do that online. So essentially what we had to do is pretty much download every Commission decision case that we could get our hands on, and search full text in that in each and every decision separately. We did rely on, and a big shout out to them, we did rely on, not them, or Brooke from the University of, had already cataloged cases on 101 TFEU, but we had to do the 102 and merger decisions ourselves, as well as the Commissioner for Competition speeches, which we thought would be a nice addition to the actual hard law of the Commission and Court of Justice decisions, because it's one thing to put something in a decision that has actually the legal effect, and it's a completely different thing to just go around universities, scholar conferences, and so on, and talk about what the goals of competition law might be, or someone might want them to be. So that contrast would be nice. So we're also covering both Article 101 and 102, so agreements and abuse of dominance, as well as merger control. And our sample extends from essentially the very first cases of EU competition law. The earliest case that we could find dates back to 1996 for the court, and 1970. Not fine, but actually catalog it as relevant to our results. The first case that we had was 1996 from 1966 for the court, and 1972 from the for the European Commission. So all in all, if you put all that together, we searched 3,351 documents. And to break that down, that was a little over 1,000 Commission decisions. As you will notice, most of them were one-on-one decisions, understandably so, because there just simply are more one-on-one cases, but also the the exemptions and all of that added to the caseload. Almost 200 decisions on 102 and 161 merger decisions. We took the decision to catalog only phase 2 remedies and prohibitions, because we thought that in phase 1 it was unlikely that there would be any meaningful discussion on the goals and purposes of competition law, and in any case, that was completely unmanageable. And we also cataloged 2,267 Court of Justice judgments and opinions, most of them by the General Court, but enough from the actual Court of Justice, and surprisingly enough, 480 opinions by the Advocate General. So all of that put together, almost 3,500 documents searched.
Right, and how did we do this search? Obviously, we didn't read the text from beginning to end, but we basically were looking for 7 overarching goals, which you're going to see in a second. Right, so we basically had 7 goals: efficiency, welfare, freedom to compete and protection of competitors, structure of competition, fairness, integration, single market, and competition as such. And these goals we derived basically by doing a literature review and kind of seeing what other people were suggesting the goals of competition law were. Now, in order to do the search, we created keywords under each of these categories. We have in total 74 keywords. So our work was basically to search for these particular keywords that you're going to see in a second in all of these 3,351 documents. So we did the search, and then we tried to see whether the hit we were getting was relevant or not relevant as a goal, because of course some of these words might appear in a different way than a goal of competition law. And here you see a little bit quickly, I will not go through them, but but basically the 74 keywords or phrases that we have used. By doing this search, we have found about,
this is for you.
Yes, a little bit over 1,000 relevant hits, so 1,085 relevant hits. And in our Excel sheets, we have cataloged 619 entries for the Commission, 340 entries for the court, and 126 entries for the AG opinions. And we're currently working on the commissioner speeches, so that part we will not present today.
So these 1,000 results are basically our list of decisions or opinions that do indeed discuss the goals of competition law in a relevant way according to our methodology. And these are the ones that we actually list as the relevant cases. For one thing, we felt that that was a surprisingly large body of case law to discuss goals and purposes. When we initially set out to do it, we thought we were going to find around 100 or 150 cases that actually do discuss this, but it was a lot more. We're going to explain a little bit more in detail our methodology to let you know what these results actually mean. But the fact that there are over 1,000 decisions that one or AG opinions that one can look at is already a big body of evidence. Now, in terms of the results, it was pretty obvious to us, looking at the aggregate results, that there is no one goal that dominates the case law or the opinions of AGs as the predominant EU competition goal. What you're looking at in this graph is the annual evolution of the goals of the 7 different groups of keywords that correspond to 7 big families of goals of competition law. And as you can see, most of them do yield results throughout the history of EU competition competition law with different nuances, of course, but it is quite obvious that there is not a single one goal, which sometimes it is the common way in normative papers. It is the common way to think of what is the goal of competition law. And normative papers usually focus on only one goal. There are the people who say it's efficiency. There are the people who say it's welfare. There are people who say it's the process of competition. And our overall results show that it's actually more than just one. The graph that you see here is the results for the commission, but as Marius is going to explain in more detail, we get comparable results both for the Court of Justice and the opinions of AGs.
Right, so as you see here, here you see three graphs. It's basically the total of the different goals. On the left is the commission, in the middle is the court, and in the right is the AGs. And as you notice from the total number of hits, competitive structure and protection of process of competition seem to be the most important ones, even though, as we were just saying, there is not one predominant goal. If you think of the curve also, so starting from efficiency to the far left and going sort of over to welfare, freedom, competitors, structure, fairness, integration, and then competition, the curve is more or less similar between the three sources. So there seems to be a certain consistency, although the ratio between the yellow that you see there, which is structure, and the blue, which is competition, seems to vary a little bit between the different sources. You will also notice that efficiency, which is at the far left, the light blue, seems to be relatively more important for AGs. I'm guessing because of particular AGs that like to talk about it, than, for example, the court or the commission. Next.
I love the subtle hint that some commissioners just love to talk about efficiency there. This is going to be all more apparent in the report. I'm mindful of time, and I don't want to stress Giorgio out or the rest of the panelists. So just very quickly,
1 minute.
Very quick observations. 1 minute. So one of the other obvious things that we noticed is that after post 1999 or early 2000s, there is a significant increase in the cases that discuss goals of competition law. Now, that doesn't mean that the discussion itself is after the early 2000s. It might just mean that there are a lot more cases that the commission and the court were handling on competition law, and inevitably so, some of them would bring up the issue. So we are going through the number of cases now. We don't have like an explanation for you in terms of why we result, but it's we're hypothesizing as to why that might be the case. And it was also obvious to us that like all goals and cases increased after 2000, but welfare and structure increased more than other goals. So it seems that the welfare, which includes total welfare, consumer welfare, and so on, and structure of competition, seem to be gaining in importance in the post-2000 case law.
All right.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop you there because your time is up. Sorry, you had your 15 minutes. Thank you very much. That was a really illuminating presentation, and I can see on the margin you've got some great questions already to field with. So I look forward to listening to you later when you discuss the questions. So let's move on to Juha's paper. So are you here? Perfect. We can see the slides.
Yeah,
okay, 15
and you
minutes
can hear
over
me
to
now.
you.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so hello everybody, and thank you especially to the organizers for making this huge effort to organize the conference. And this ASCOLA conference is also always the highlight of my year, and I'm really pleased to be here in this panel to organized by Giorgio. And my presentation deals with sustainability and competition law, and not as such sustainability as a goal, but or the problems related to can sustainability be taken into account in competition law, but I'm focusing on how sustainability benefits could be assessed and verified if argued as or claimed as justifications for anti-competitive practices. And the brief background for this work is that I'm currently working in a large research project that deals with sustainable chemicals or plastics and value chains and all kinds of issues, and we are dealing with certain legal issues in that project. And in that project, there are also environmental scientists who are doing life cycle analysis, and that has been quite illuminating to kind of learn. And what has become clear is that sustainability is actually quite a complex thing, and things that may sound and look sustainable in closer inspection are not really sustainable, and I'll come to that in a bit. But this has some implications for competition law assessment and competition law policy, because these kinds of benefits are hard to prove, and they are to some extent uncertain and quite specific. And I'm now going to focus on how these kinds of benefits could be kind of verified in competition law, and at the same time how it could be made sure that it's not too difficult for firms to justify their practices with sustainability benefits. And I'll start with how sustainability benefits could be established in terms of kind of scientific methods. And one particularly useful method apparently would be so-called life cycle analysis. And it's an internationally standardized method, and it's already used in some other areas of law and policy. And the idea is that the kind of whole life cycle of products is examined, and all the kind of causal effects to that. So that means starting from how the raw materials are produced and how energy is produced, and then moving on to production, distribution, and how the products are used and what happens to the products after use. So if they are, for instance, recycled or burned or whatever, is what happens to them. And this kind of methods could also be used in competition law to establish sustainability benefits in a theoretically and empirically robust way. So it could be relied on by companies and competition authorities. And by comparing, for instance, a scenario where one manufacturing process is used that is agreed upon by firms to the other manufacturing processes they would use without the agreement, you can see kind of the difference in, for instance, CO2 emissions. So there are ways to establish these benefits, but there are some kind of qualifications and limitations that apply to the results. And one of them is that because the kind of causal effects on different parts of the life cycle can point at different right directions, determining like an overall improvement can be quite tricky, and that may apply only in specific circumstances. And of course, kind of the analysis has to be based on some kind of assumptions on what kind of technologies are used and things like that, and what the existing structures for, let's say, how raw materials are produced are. And of course, these are not completely precise methods because data can be approximate and the assessments are not exact. So for instance, if we think about the sustainability of using cotton or plastic carrier bags, the overall sustainability really depends on how long they would be used and how they are treated once they are used, whether they are burned or they end up in the nature. And also it depends on which factors we focus on, like do we emphasize the CO2 emissions or do we emphasize the microplastics? So this overall means that the kind of the established benefits are not that straightforward or obvious, but maybe quite conditional and specific as well as to some extent uncertain. So what challenges does this pose to competition law and policy? So here first are some kind of more maybe mundane challenges that include that these kinds of assessments are quite extensive when carried out in the context of competition law and can be therefore quite costly. And this is because if you think about competition law assessment, you may need kind of several counterfactuals in the assessment of, for instance, efficiencies and so forth. Another is that information is required on the whole life cycle, and that could be a problem in because the companies involved do not necessarily have all the information about how the products are used or the raw materials are produced and on what happens then in different countries when they are disposed of. And related to the, well, maybe related to cost is that this requires expertise in the environmental sciences that is not something that competition lawyers and economists normally possess. But what might be kind of the major problem, and at least the one I'm focusing on, is that introducing the sustainability interests or benefits into antitrust assessment increases the kind of uncertainty related to whether the practices can be justified or not. So simply having the new factors that often are unpredictable, that is whether benefits are produced in a specific situation, adds some uncertainty, as well as if we overall add a dimension of balancing in antitrust that is consider sustainability in a greater extent, that adds to the uncertainty. And as has been discussed by many authors, there's some uncertainty relating to the legal standards and possibly some limitations also regarding how and to what extent these benefits can be taken into account. And there are also quite major policy choices that need to be made if sustainability issues are taken more broadly into account. And this kind of combined uncertainty kind of weighs against the companies claiming sustainability benefits as justifications, because at least initially the burden is on them to prove that the justification applies, and that might have a negative outcome of preventing companies from adopting practices that would actually overall be desirable due to producing sustainability benefits. Of course, there are also other concerns, but I'm focusing for the rest of the presentation on this concern. So what could be done about this uncertainty? How could the different kinds of uncertainties be reduced? So one method would be simply to pass a new block exemption or address these these kinds of situations in guidelines and create, for instance, some kinds of safe harbors that provide legal certainty to companies. But in terms of sustainability benefits, that's not very broadly possible because they are not really determined by the type of conduct concerned or even a specific material or technology or process used. But because of this causal effects on the life cycle, often a more extensive analysis is required. So it's hard to kind of assume that sustainability is promoted in a specific situation. But of course, it would be possible to at least exclude anti-competitive harm, anti-competitive effects or object in certain situations and avoid kind of the problem that way, or there could be some situations like some technologies or materials that are so clearly beneficial that they could be kind of assumed that switching to them could be typically beneficial. And of course, it would be possible to elaborate the kind of general framework for assessing sustainability benefits, kind of the economics and legal aspects, and as well as the kind of environmental science aspects. But as I mentioned, these kinds of possibilities are quite limited. So maybe there could be need for some kind of prior authorization procedure for practices that are claimed to be beneficial to sustainability. And of course, those could quite well address the factual uncertainties as well as the uncertainties related to the antitrust assessment of the claimed benefits. And at the same time, the benefits could hopefully be sufficiently be kind of verified. And probably if those kinds of procedures would be offered, it would be necessary, but also possible to limit kind of the authorization to the appropriate time and other scope. And there would be need to do so because, as I mentioned earlier, the established benefits are kind of limited to certain assumptions made and certain conditions. So when anything changes, something that used to be sustainable is not necessarily so anymore. And there are some legal basis already, like the possibility of the Commission to make non-infringement decisions. So before I conclude, I briefly discussed the kind of general antitrust standards. And of course, the existing standards could be clarified to include sustainability benefits. And that would help the antitrust assessment and reduce uncertainty. But I see some benefits in adopting a new substantive exemption. And that really relates to, first of all, avoiding some problems that stretching the existing concepts would have, as well as there would be some benefits to designing this exemption specifically for sustainability benefits. So when we have a broader set of interests to balance, I'm not sure if the existing standards are specific enough or make the right choices. And just to give a final example, the current standards might allow sort of cherry picking of sustainability benefits to justify anti-competitive practices and ignore others. But I think my time's up, so I thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a really nice presentation, bringing in some of the economics to allow us to sharpen the legal framework. So let's move to our next speaker, who is Dina Vaket, if you can upload your slides.
Yes.
And thank you everybody for the really good questions. Please keep them coming in.
All right, so hello everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I thank the organizers for the amazing effort to put this together. Today I'll be talking about a paper that I titled Big Business, Innovation and Growth, with a question about the market structure that's responsible for generating innovation and growth. So basically what I set out as a sort of an introduction to that topic is the fact that all around us now, from the political scene to academic publications and media coverage, we're hearing antitrust laws being discussed, particularly in the context of market structure. And this, a lot of people are saying that antitrust has made a comeback at the turn of 2020. I'm sure for this crowd, we don't necessarily agree, because for us antitrust has always been there, but for a lot of people, suddenly everyone is talking about antitrust in different contexts. And I sat back to think about what has got everyone interested in antitrust suddenly. And for a lot of people from outside of that particular group, a lot of it has to do with big tech and big business. So big tech, big business, and to a large extent, 4 particular companies, so Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple, but also rising concentration levels in manufacturing industries across the world, but particularly in the developing countries. So what I set out to look at in this paper is sort of the market structure of these companies, and what is the problem with market structure, or is there really not a problem at all? So the assumption has always been that these big companies and these large market-sized firms have achieved an indispensable status that has not only affected market and the economy in general and competitors, but has harmed consumers. So to a large extent, there's often a question is, have consumers really been harmed? Because many of these companies are offering products that are actually very low priced, and to some extent, even free goods and services are offered by these companies. So the question is that really something that is bad for consumers? And here, it's not part of this paper, but I just want to put it out there. This challenges once again, and I've written about that before, the focus of antitrust on consumer welfare. Has this been really the right criteria to guide antitrust enforcement all through now the developed and the developing world? Or has it in one way or another contributed to allowing liberal markets to facilitate the domination of big tech now, but also monopolies across the world? So one of the main problems with big tech today, but also rising concentration levels in general, is that they harm the economy in general, and they harm competitors and consumers if we relax that assumption that consumers actually benefit when they get lower prices. But this is often paired with another strong argument, is that actually these companies, they manage to innovate, and this innovation leads to growth that is particularly important for countries in the global south. So the assumption is that these companies have innovated more than anyone else, and these companies are necessary, and monopolies in general are necessary to generate a sufficient amount of innovation that will then facilitate growth and develop. So in a way, this is a very old debate. There is nothing new there. So this is an old debate, but just recontextualized in a hot topic that we're discussing now. And it is rooted in 2 big theoretical models, or 2 big theoretical assumptions, about each leading to different conclusions. So we have the Schumpeterian model that I will go in a second, saying that actually concentration is the market structure that is necessary to push for innovation and to generate innovation and growth. And this is on the opposite end of the spectrum. You have the now neo-Brandeisians, or previously Darwinian competition advocates, that are saying actually that's not true at all. It's only competitive markets that push the companies to innovate and thereby generate growth and ultimately develop. So the Schumpeterian arguments have been rooted in Schumpeter's seminal work on creative destruction, written in the 40s. And the main assumption there is that monopoly profits are not only necessary to pursue R&D and innovation, but also the security of a monopoly position gives the monopolist this dream to actually do that sort of innovation, because they will reach that position. And they are the group of companies that are scared the most by not innovating, because they fear to lose the market structure of that dominant position that they're having. And there has been a lot of empirical work, particularly in the early 90s, that has supported this claim. And we also have some evidence from Japan and Korea, where during the years of their most rapid growth, they have actually deliberately restricted competition. On the other end of the spectrum, we have those that actually say that all of that doesn't really hold. It's actually competitive markets that push companies to innovate. And here we have all literature from Adam Smith all through Michael Porter, and then now resurfaced with the neo-Brandeisians, basically saying that actually we need competitive market structures, and that is going to lead to innovation and growth. And you have also a lot of empirical evidence by Aguillon, Blundell and Griffith, Porter, Scherer, and others. And in a way, this has become the dominant mainstream understanding of how we need to organize our markets. And I think we saw it in Konstantinos and Mario's presentation, that this is sort of, even in looking just at Europe, this is the goal of antitrust enforcement, that we need to just push for more competitive market structure. So this has influenced supranational organization, movements behind deregulation, free trade, and market openness, and so on. Now, there's another theory that says that it's actually a mix of both. So it's neither just the Schumpeterian arguments or the Darwinian arguments, it's actually a mix of both. And this is particularly the work of Aguillon and his colleagues that showed that the relationship follows an inverted U-shaped graph. And they weren't the first one to talk about that. So there were earlier established work by Levin, Cohen, Maury, Scherer. And the quote I put out here is actually by Scherer, that tells us that more competition accelerates innovation within limit. But when competition becomes so intense that any given rival can anticipate appropriating only a small share of the innovation's benefit, still more competition retards innovation. So competition is great up to a certain point, but then we see the curve going down. So what I set out to do is I set out to actually test that, and test that using data that I introduce first the measurements, what I was setting out to do, and then I will introduce the data that I got. So the first equation that you see here is the equation that I use to measure competition. So this can be critiqued because it's a proxy of the Lehner index, but for lack of any other appropriate measurements, that's sort of the measurement that Aguillon and his colleagues and a lot of people that have done this work have looked at. So this is an equation that is given by the differential between value added and the total wage bill as a proportion of gross output. And basically what is measured here is surplus value, or in economic terms, just simply rents, as an indicator of pricing power. So can firms really price above their competitors? And then I use the second formula, and this I use following Scherer's work, and this is a formula that measures growth. And as you can see, this is a measure of labor productivity growth. And the reason I wanted to only focus on labor productivity growth is that I thought that it is important to capture with that measurement dynamic efficiency or technological progress, and not just growth in the more GDP kind of growth. And here the measurement looks at the difference between the log value of added, of value added over employees, and the lag of the log value, the value added over employees. And the data that I used to calculate these two formulas has been UNIDO's industrial statistics database. So I looked at one database that was running from 1990 or through 2008. And from that data set for 24 industries, I collected data for 69 developing countries and 20 developed countries. And then from a larger database that stopped in 2006, but that ran from the 60s, I had another set to verify the results, again for 28 industries, but here for only 47 developing countries. And the data basically that I was collecting were the number of employees, wages, output, and value added, so that I could calculate the two formulas that I just showed. Now, if we just go through some descriptive statistics or descriptive analysis of the results that I found, is that average markups in developing countries are higher than in developed countries, which is sort of expected because we know in advance that concentration levels in developing countries are higher. Countries with the highest mean markups in the developed world were Qatar, the US, and then Korea. And then in the developed countries, those with the lowest markups were Germany, and then followed by France and Norway. When we look at the developing countries, those with the highest average markups were Armenia, Suriname, and Ethiopia. And those with the lowest markups were Macedonia, Lithuania, and Senegal. Now, if we look at the relationship, which is the heart of the question that I'm asking, between competition and growth, just descriptively, this graph is what is produced when I look at the 69 developing countries, and that's for the smaller database from the 90s or through 2008. And you can see here that it's an obviously negative relationship between the markups and growth. And I get the same sort of graph when I look at the same relationship in the 20 developed countries that I look at. But we all know, and economists have taught us, that we cannot interpret the results from these descriptive figures because there must be, or there might be, contemporaneous shocks that are affecting both the margins and the growth at the same time. And that's why what I did is I looked at an empirical methodology to test the effect of competition and growth using the formula that you see here. So the specification of the models are given by this formula. Basically, I look at labor productivity growth and the relationship between that and the markups in country J, industry I at time T. And then I add, to test for the inverted U part of the graph, a quadratic term of the markups to the right-hand side of the equation. So I run the equation twice, once only testing for the markups, and then once testing for the quadratic term of the markups to see if we get this inverted U relationship that Scherer and his colleagues predicted. And I use all the typical tests and adjustment to make sure that the results are shielded from any disturbances. So I add country, industry, and time fixed effects to make sure that the results are robust. I use robust standard errors to control for heteroscedasticity. I address indigeneity by lagging the PCM values by 1 year. And the measurement, the coefficient that we're interested in here is the beta coefficient, and to see whether it is negative or not. So if it is negative, then it is true that markups have a negative relationship with growth. And this is exactly what the results here show for 69 developing countries. So you see that across the different columns, and I can spend a minute just saying what these different columns represent. So that in the first column are just the results for a simple ORS regression with country fixed effects. In the second column, I add year fixed effects. And then in the third column, I add industry fixed effects. And the errors in the first 3 columns are clustered at the country level, except for then column 4, where the errors are clustered at both the country and the industry level. And as you can see from the 4 columns, that an increase in the markups is negatively affecting labor productivity growth, and the results are significant at the 1% level. So this testifies to the robustness of the relationship as we add these different specifications to the model, and it actually proves that markups or rents are negatively related to growth. Now, the same results I get when I look, I'm not going to report it here, but I get the same results when I look for the developed countries, also significant at the 1% level. But what I want to emphasize that because the coefficients from the table are problematic to interpret them directly, I had to do, because the growth rates are logged and the nominal values of the margins are used, I had to use a method that's called the marginal effect or the partial effects to look at the relationship particularly. And basically what I found is that in developing countries, if we look at the mean markups of 0.22, if we increase it by 10%, then growth decreases by almost 3%, which is enormous. And the same for the developing countries. If we increase the mean markups of 0.2 by 10%, then growth decreases by 0.9%, so almost 1%, which is a lot less than the effect that an increase in markups has on the developing countries, which shows that this is a particular issue that developing countries should pay attention to if they don't want to lose more of their growth rates. Now, for the second part of my results, when I look at the quadratic term on the right-hand side of the equation, what we see here and the expected if the results are actually following Scherer, and we're going to see that inverted U shape, is that the beta coefficients for the price cost margins or the markups should be positive. And that's exactly what you see here again for 69 developing countries. So this actually shows that there is this inverted U relationship that we could see in the developing countries for that larger data set, and also for the smaller data set that I had the exact same results for the developing countries. However, here you see that for the developed countries, it is insignificant. So it doesn't hold, the results don't hold for the developed countries. So we don't see the same inverted U relationship between competition, between markups and growth for the developed world, sorry.
You have about 1 minute to wrap up, so.
Exactly,
okay,
exactly. So I'm exactly at the conclusion. So basically what I did with this paper using these data sets is to look at this relationship between the markups and competition and growth. What I showed here that I think is particularly interesting, and I'll jump to that immediately, for the developing countries, is that we do see that inverted U-shaped graph. We don't see it in the developed world, but we see it in the developing world very obviously, which sort of challenges our assumption that we need to push developing countries to just open up their market, pursue perfectly competitive, absolute competition all through. And there actually needs to be a state-guided marketplace that manages to assure the balance between initially breaking up entrenched elites' power over certain means of production, but then we should not push it towards the ideal of perfect competition. And this is probably an issue that has to do with development, because then if we look at the developed world, we don't see the same inverted U. So maybe at a higher state of development, then this relationship doesn't hold anymore. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. That was a really fascinating paper with lots of interesting data. Let's move on to our next speaker, Theodosia. Okay, we can see the slides. Off you go.
I would like to thank you so much for giving the opportunity to present my research findings at this excellent venue. So my current research project actually explores the role of popular academic ranking systems as the promoting quality in higher education, but more importantly, the role of antitrust law in protecting and ensuring this objective. And I decided to initiate this project inspired by the growing, albeit unsettled debate on whether universities actually be allowed to cooperate and boycott popular academic ranking systems, such as the US News ranks, with a view to promoting the educational quality and the education mission universities actually commit to preserve. For instance, in 2007, 12 colleges in the United States decided to boycott the US News ranks on the basis that such rankings actually mislead rather than inform students, specifically by stating that the US News ranks merely focus on status and prestige, and they fail to assess important dimensions of educational quality, such as learning outcomes. The leaders of these colleges actually agreed to stop providing their data to the US News magazine, but also to abstain from using the ranks in their promotional efforts and advertising campaigns. But analogous important concerns have also been raised by prominent higher education scholars and experts in the United States. Specifically, they raised the concern that the US News ranks, by creating a prestige battle between universities in which the winners take it all, they actually incentivize universities to harm cultural and economic diversity, important components of educational quality. This is because the US News ranks, as critiques actually were, encourage universities to mainly admit the students that are outstanding from the rankings perspective, that is higher income students. In an attempt to spark this debate, our research actually aims to address these questions. Should universities be allowed to boycott the US News ranks in order to free themselves of the prestige battle in which they are forced to participate? can an anti-rankings boycott be justified by antitrust law on the basis and allow universities to improve their quality and increase opportunities for the lower income students? Albeit crucial, I believe that such questions are not easy to address, mainly because although such anti-rankings boycott may be beneficial from higher education perspective, they are sorely harmful from competition law perspective. And this is because, as we all know, one of the central mantras of competition policy is that competitive market forces, besides lowering prices, will necessarily promote quality. In an attempt to address this conflict and to delve into my research questions, first in my paper, I actually examined how the US News actually are saved, but also the frequent critiques of the US News ranks and methodology. I believe that my paper actually reached some interesting findings. First, the risk that the US News ranks may actually not reflect the true quality of each academic institution, and therefore they may mislead instead of usefully informing students, is actually real. This is because the data on the basis of which the US News calculate its schools run may actually be the result of all the creative strategies universities actually employ to move up in the rank. In other words, a higher rank may also be the result of successful gaming. For example, to calculate each school's performance, the US News ranks take into account the incoming students' SAT scores. To improve their students' SAT scores and therefore to achieve a higher rank, universities actually have very high incentives to engage in an innocent cooking of data. For example, they very often exclude the SAT scores of specific student groups, such as internationals, the lower income students, or the athletes. But the risk that the ranks may not necessarily reflect the true quality of each academic institution is also real, because the changes in the university's rank may often be caused by the US News frequent methodological changes rather than changes in the quality of each academic institution. But my research also shows that the risk that the US News ranks may encourage universities to restrict opportunities for lower income students, compromise on diversity, and therefore contribute to the production of inequality also cannot be excluded. This is because to win in the rankings game and improve their rank, universities actually have to continuously increase their faculty and financial resources. Essentially, this means that unless universities continuously increase their investments in fancy libraries, wonderful but costly reading rooms, labs, and canteens, they may actually fail to move up in the rank. However, the strategies universities have to employ to improve their relative position in the rankings actually increase their costs and ultimately tuitions. In addition, to move up in the rank, universities also have to admit the students with outstanding SAT scores. Achieving, however, high scores in this test is not only a matter of student potential or intelligence. More importantly, as research demonstrates, it is a matter of preparation. Therefore, this means that the students that actually achieve excellent, outstanding SAT scores are probably the more affluent ones whose families can afford the intensive and extremely costly training excellent SAT results actually require. To attract the students with top SAT scores, universities in the US have high incentives to provide more scholarships on merit and less on the basis of need. However, given that student SAT scores correlate with student socioeconomic status, many deserving lower-income students may actually be deprived of the opportunity to graduate from a top academic institution. University leaders actually have not stopped their ears to these concerns. Indeed, they actually admit that they're neither proud of their data creativity nor the creative strategies they increasingly employ in order to be the winners in the ranking scale. However, although university leaders actually admit that the US News ranks encourage them to compromise social and economic diversity and to restrict opportunities for lower income students and to engage in socially wasteful investments, they also say that if they opt out of the game, their ability to attract star faculty, star students, and generous alumni donations will actually diminish. In this slide, I believe that the antitrust question of my paper, can the schools boycott the US news ranks without actually violating the antitrust mandate, is topical. To explore and delve into this question, I also delved into the potential pro-competitive justifications universities may bring to the fore in order to justify their anti-rankings boycott. Very briefly, these are the market failure justification and the market create inequality justification. On the basis of the market failure justification, for example, universities may try to raise the claim that markets fail in higher education. And markets fail because instead of leading to lower prices and increased quality, they actually lead to higher tuition fees and lower educational quality. By boycotting, therefore, the ranks, universities actually may do nothing more than imposing a ban on a ranking system that encourages them to increase their tuition fees and harm diversity, important component of educational quality. How would, however, the US antitrust enforcement in the court evaluate this type of justification? I believe that the answer to this question is not a straightforward one. However, considering the Supreme Court's ruling in the California Dental Association case, or else the CDA case, I believe that the US antitrust enforcers in the courts may not necessarily reject this type of market failure defense. In the California Association case, the Supreme Court actually examined whether the CDA's Code of Ethics, the Code of Ethics of the Dental Association, which restricted substantially the freedom of dentists to advertise the quality and prices of their services, actually violated the antitrust mandate. Although the FTC and the Court of Appeals actually took the view that such restrictions violate the Sherman Act, the Supreme Court took a totally different view. Essentially, the Supreme Court claimed that the restrictions that were imposed by the CDA's Code of Ethics were actually aimed at eliminating false or misleading advertising in a market characterized by high information asymmetries. Due to this market failure, therefore, the Supreme Court adopted the approach that CDA's restrictions may be nothing more than a pro-competitive ban on puffery. In an analogous manner, therefore, I believe universities may try to support the claim that their anti-rankings boycott may be nothing more than a pro-competitive ban on a ranking system that encourages them to increase their tuition fees and harm diversity, an important component of quality. In the context of a market creating inequality justification, universities may try to raise different types of concerns. They may, for example, try to argue that by playing the rankings game, universities actually are highly incentivized to restrict opportunities for the lower income students and therefore to contribute to the production of inequality. To regain, therefore, their important role as social institutions that wish to promote access to education and promote equality of opportunity, they should be free to boycott the ranks and collectively agree to adopt policies that will increase the opportunities for the less privileged students. So far, the Supreme Court and the US antitrust enforcers have not examined a boycott on the basis of this type of justification. However, I believe that in the case at issue, the antitrust enforcers may have good reasons to think of this approach on the basis of two factors. First, that access to education and the pursuit of equality of opportunity reduce inequalities and contribute to economic growth. Therefore, an agreement between universities that may actually increase opportunities for lower income students and promote equality of opportunity may make societies not only fairer, but also richer in the long term. Second, access to elite education has become a key facility in entering and expanding in winner-take-all markets, such as advanced technology markets. As, however, universities are increasingly employ strategies that restrict opportunities for the lower income students, there are many deserving students are deprived of elite education credentials. If, however, they increase their access to elite education, the opportunity to enter the markets and contribute to the economy would actually increase. Their active participation in the economy boosts the economic growth and would increase the economic pie for all parts of the society. However, in my paper, I raised the concern that competition authorities may actually fail to take into account the goal of equality of opportunity under the traditional consumer welfare standard approach. And this is because if competition authorities wish to integrate the goal of equality of opportunity into their assessment, they may actually have to take the stance that the positive impact on the welfare, the positive impact of the boycott on the welfare of the poor weighs more than this negative impact on the rich. However, under the traditional consumer welfare standard approach, both rich and poor count equally. Therefore, I propose that competition authorities may have to adopt a more inclusive welfare standard when they examine the goal of equality of opportunities. Although weighing the interests of different consumer groups may be a difficult task for competition authorities, they have a good reason to perform this task in the case at issue on the basis that access to education benefits not only the poor, but the society as a whole. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much also for keeping right on time. So our final presentation is from Ramsey Woodcock. Good morning.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, fantastic. So let us get started here. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, and let's see. Is it in presentation view for you now?
Now it is.
It is. Okay. Well, pleasure to be here and really an honor to be on a panel with so many thoughtful scholars. So I'm going to be talking about a project that arose from considering debates primarily in the United States context over regulation of the tech giants, and in particular, the proposal of Senator Elizabeth Warren that the tech giants and platforms generally shouldn't be allowed to compete on their own platforms. This was a proposal that she made while running for president. And basic idea was a company like Amazon, which has third-party sellers on its platform, shouldn't be allowed to also manufacture and sell its own products on the platform because there's an obvious conflict of interest. So a lot of this debate has been carried out, particularly from this sort of new Brandeisian approach in language that sounds a lot more like the language we use in constitutional law than the sort of language that we're used to in antitrust, which is to say, a lot of it has been about sort of, sellers' rights or so analogies to the oppression, governmental oppression. Amazon is a kind of shadow government that's, oppressively regulating the behavior of firms on these platforms. And that got me thinking about whether there's actually something that we could learn from developing this analogy and really seeing if we can look at constitutional law and the state itself as a kind of antitrust policy. So this paper is very much an attempt to sort of develop this idea that that what the state does may be very similar to what antitrust tries to do. So one of the things I'm going to try to convince you of is that antitrust is almost, in fact, does what constitutional law does and does it with greater breadth than constitutional law, which is to say that our concept of power in antitrust actually includes the kind of power that constitutions try to regulate themselves. So it encompasses what we might call government power, but goes beyond that to also encompass sort of private economic power. And that once we realize that, it helps us to actually draw this analogy and learn things from the way constitutional law tries to handle the particular type of power that lies at the heart of government. And from that analysis, I'm going to try at the end to draw some conclusions about how the tech giants should be regulated. So in order to make this this analogy work, I have to do some sort of heavy-duty conceptual work on antitrust. So part of this project is reconceiving what antitrust actually does to make it clear that what it does is similar to what the state does. So I'm going to argue here that antitrust really does two things. It regulates the acquisition of control over essential inputs. And the idea here is that control over essential inputs is what gives us power in markets. It regulates acquisition of control over essential inputs, and it also regulates the exploitation of the power that comes from that control. So this maps onto the sort of traditional categories that we have in antitrust of the regulation of collusion and then the regulation of single firm conduct. But it maps in a way that I think particularly to those of you who are familiar with the European system, and I don't pretend to be, but I know just enough, the mapping is going to seem a little bit strange here because this concept of exploitation is sort of its own separate concept in EU law. But what I'm arguing here is that abuse of dominance is regulation of the exploitation of the power that comes from centralization of control over inputs. And regulation of collusion is really about regulating the centralization of that control. So to give you an example, consider a pencil company. One of the essential inputs to pencils is graphite, right? You use that to make the marks on the paper. What antitrust does is it regulates, if one company wants to take control over all the graphite in order to exclude other firms from the market, the way it's going to do that is through some kind of collusive behavior. Either it's getting together and forming a hub and spoke type cartel in which it's sort of the ringmaster and the graphite producers are being coordinated and they're being bound through exclusivity deals not to sell to competitors downstream in the pencil market, or merger is taking place so that the pencil company already owns, say, half of the the raw graphite that's available in the world, merges with another firm that owns the other half. Now we've got complete control over that graphite input. So the collusive idea, understood broadly to include the idea of foreclosure and merger, is basically what deals with this issue of acquisition of power. And then the abuse of dominance concept, the single firm concept, single firm conduct concept, is about once you've got that control, you've got a measure of control over these inputs, to what extent can you use that control in order to raise prices or harm competitors to the end of raising prices. And so the base in antitrust, basically we tend to be very tolerant of the use of that power in order to raise prices, to negotiate higher prices. Less so perhaps in Europe, and certainly in the United States with the conduct requirement. However, we're much more concerned with other sort of indirect ways in which we can use that centralized control to enhance pricing power. So for example, a refusal to deal, right, sometimes is a violation of the antitrust laws. What is that? Well, you're taking power already acquired through the centralization of inputs, and you're now using it to deny those inputs to competitors, which then lessens their ability to compete and allows you to raise prices. So that I classify as exploitation of power. You've got it, you've centralized control of the input. Now, what can you do with that centralized control, right? A prohibition on refusals to deal limits your ability to exploit that power. So that's the reconceptualization that I'm working on here, right? So it's about looking at how you centralize control over the inputs in order to harm competition in the focus market and thereby raise prices to consumers. Okay, so that's my reconceptualization, but let's put that aside for a second. Let me return to the other point that I made, which is that we can think of antitrust as having a broader concept of power than even the kind of power that we regulate in constitutional law. So my argument here is that constitutional law and government power is really about the monopoly over the use of force. Right? You monopolize the use of force. That's what governments do. And constitutional law is about regulating both the acquisition of power, of the monopoly over the use of force, so but particularly about regulating its exploitation. So once the government has a monopoly on force, when can it deploy it? Well, is that use of force monopoly, is that really the same thing as our market power concept? My argument is that it is. So when we talk about market power, we say, well, market power is the capacity profitably to raise prices by a substantial amount. So what is that? If we break that down, what is that exactly? Well, it's the idea that you can dictate a higher price to the market, and that when you do that, not so many consumers will rebel by not buying your product as to make dictating that higher price unprofitable, right? As to make that dictation ineffective in a sense. Well, isn't that really what government deployment or exploitation of the force monopoly is really all about, right? It's if the government, let's say, there's an analogy to a dictator, right? A dictator says, go do this. Well, what is that exactly? That's you're dictating a particular price. There's something that you're demanding from your subjects, just as in the case of our concept of monopoly power, you're dictating a price. And indeed, in antitrust, I don't know about in the European context, but in the US, certainly barter is included. So the price doesn't have to be dollar valued. You can dictate a service price in the form of do this for me, you have to do more for me now. That's dictating a higher price. So there's no difference there. The dictator says, go do this, and the concept of power profitably to raise price. So what is that? Well, you've got power if when you dictate, people actually follow, right? They don't rebel, they don't refuse to do it to such a degree that the dictator ends up worse off, meaning an unprofitable attempt to raise price than they might otherwise. And there's always an exchange, right, in political power. Because what lies behind the dictator's demand? Well, it's the threat that if you don't do what I say, you'll be harmed, right? You'll be imprisoned, you'll be jailed, you'll be killed. So what's the exchange? The dictator is saying, the price I'm charging you for security is X, right? So there's always an exchange. So this concept, the concept of market power, is broad enough to include political power. In the US context, at least, the only reason we don't traditionally apply it there is because we've already got constitutional law there doing it, right? So there's a kind of supremacy issue. And also custom, pure custom, right? That we think about antitrust as living in the business context and not living outside of it. But there are some cases, for example, in the US context, there are some cases in which the antitrust laws have been used to go after the mafia, right? After the mob. Through protection rackets as a kind of cartelization in which you're raising the cost of security. So there are a few interesting cases out there that start to cross the line. Okay, so now let's do the contrast between these approaches. What can we learn from the way constitutional law handles this monopoly power problem about how maybe we should think about handling the platform power problem? So what is, in the US context, how does antitrust law deal with it? It basically antitrust law says, well, acquisitions of power are okay so long as they improve the product, to just boil it down probably excessively, right? There's a sort of efficiency concept, a consumer welfare concept. That's how antitrust handles this problem. You can cartelize if you're going to do research and development, right, and produce a better product. How does the state handle the acquisition of power issue? Well, one is within the geographic boundaries of the state, the criminal law steps in and basically prevents private actors from eroding the force monopoly. So there's a sort of, in the analogy here is to property law, right? I mean, once a company has legally acquired an input, that's it, they own it. Antitrust generally won't step in except in very extreme circumstances and prevent them from owning it. Let's say they develop the raw material, they develop the graphite mine themselves, you have ownership rights, that's it. Nobody can trespass, the law will kick them out. The criminal law protects the government's force monopoly in a similar way. More broadly, there's just and acquisition analogy just gets very crazy. We can think of, which governments get to exercise the force monopoly. There's a kind of global cartel, right? That's the United Nations, that's international law in which all the the different monopolists divide the market for control over the forced monopoly across the earth. Okay, this part is not going to be terribly useful for a tech giant analysis. But now let's come to exploitation. So with respect to exploitation, I think it's fair to think of the antitrust laws as having two sort of broad views of what kinds of exploitation are acceptable. The first is you control all those inputs. That means you can dictate a higher price downstream to consumers. Generally, if you're dictating higher prices in order to cover your costs, antitrust is not going to have a problem with it. In fact, in the US, you can charge any kind of bargaining over dollar valued price is not going to be problematic. But there's another kind of exploitation, right? You can also use your control over the input to basically integrate, right? To integrate vertically downstream and to take over, intermediate production markets, intermediate steps in the supply chain. Think of Apple, for example, designing its own CPUs for Macs instead of purchasing from the CPU market. Right? I mean, if Apple were large enough in the computer industry, it could essentially wipe out all the other CPU manufacturers by integrating down vertically. That kind of power is regulated more carefully based on our sort of vertical merger rules and our vertical contracting rules. And the question here is really about efficiencies, right? We look at, is this vertical integration— 1 minute left.
Can you wrap up?
Is this vertical integration going to be useful? So how does the state handle this issue of vertical integration? This is the key insight that comes from this analysis, right? The state, there are two sort of main areas in which we can think of the state forced monopoly integrating vertically into production. One is labor, right? Think about the Middle Ages where you had serfs and you had slavery, right? There was essentially, that was the forced monopoly owning the labor input, right? Complete vertical integration. And over time, the history of the development of the state and democracy and constitutional law has said, well, no, we actually think it's more efficient to de-integrate these two levels, the labor input and the forced monopoly. It's actually more efficient to do that. But there are clearly conflicts of interest that can arise. And so what we also want to do is have governance. And so the lesson from all of this for platform tech monopolies is that if we look at constitutional law, the way we deal with the monopolization problem is through governance, not through sort of blanket rules like the platform shouldn't be able to compete on its own in its own markets. And so maybe we should take a page from the book of the governmental approach to power and look at governance itself as a remedy. So could the remedy for an antitrust suit against Amazon be Amazon has to become a consumer cooperative, meaning a corporate form or organizational remedy? So I'll leave it there since I'm out of time.
Okay, thank you very much. That was really insightful. You started from a very unusual place. So I'm going to now give each speaker about 5 minutes to respond. I see the questions are a bit imbalanced. So for some of the speakers, I'm also going to just pause and ask if anybody wants to ask a question verbally at that time. We need to wrap up promptly. So the session officially closes at 5 minutes to the hour, wherever you are. However, the room will remain open for another 10 minutes for a virtual coffee break. Okay, so if you want to stay and chat with the speakers for another 10 minutes, that's fine, but you're not absolutely required to be there. You can just switch off and take a walk and get a coffee in the 10 minutes in between the two sessions. So let me start with Konstantinos and Mario, if they want to respond to some of the comments that they've received.
Yes. Okay, so I can see there were a lot of questions. I've tried to take some notes. I'll just start giving unsatisfactory answers because I have to be like super quick. Giorgio, stop me when you want, and then the rest I'll answer in chat. So, I don't want to go over time. Just whenever it runs out, stop me and I'll type them out. Okay, so starting from the beginning, Jan in question 1 asks why the text string competition as such is classified as under structure rather than under process of competition. Well, the answer is just very simple. The expression competition as such, it only came up as a result in the expression. It was all just a fixed expression. Article 81, not 101 or 85, however you want to call it, aims to protect not only the interests of competitors or of consumers, but also the structure of the market, and in doing so, competition as such. So we thought that there is this kind of like link between structure of the market and competition as such, and we decided to count it together. Question 2 by Marcos. I'm wondering why, oh no, that's the same thing. I would expect, Marcos would expect different goals stressing mergers, dominance, and cartel cases. Did this happen? The interpretation of the results is only sort of like half in. The quick answer is yes. But before we can be sure that this is really the case, we need to make sure that we factor in the total number of cases in each of those categories. So in most of the cases, obviously, agreements were the ones where most of the keywords appeared, but agreements were most of the cases anyway. So it doesn't really mean anything in that sense. And we will filter out, but even so, you might notice, for example, that in agreements, the goal of freedom, so commercial freedom, freedom of competitors, freedom of competition, and so on, and integration, which is like the attainment of the single market as a goal, were disproportionately represented. Moving on to question 3 by Giorgio. Did some text count more than others? For example, whether a grand chamber decision would count more as the smaller divisions? The answer is no. Unfortunately, it would be too complex for us to weigh them differently. We do understand that not every decision is, I mean, as Mario said, all decisions and opinions are all equal, but we didn't apply a different weight, even though we understand that some might, in essence, be a little more influential than others. In question 4 asks, how do we decide whether to classify these values as goals rather than as exceptions to competition law? So the way that we did it in the very beginning was that we went through the normative literature first, and we looked into what the authors interpret from their own search and anecdotal case law interpretation, what they interpret the goals to be, and that was our starting point. And we came up with about, say, 40 keywords, and then essentially we started looking at the decisions themselves, and we went back and added additional keywords, and we regrouped them, and there was a lot of important reorganization as we were going through the cases. And once we had like we were confident that we built sort of like a body of case law that was enough to show us how the court or the commission itself treats them as goals, then we reapplied the uniform methodology again from the beginning. So we try to make sure that what we count as a goal is indeed a goal. I mean, in a way, if you count something like this too many times as an exception, doesn't it become a goal in the end? Stefan, in question 5.
Okay, can I stop you there? I think 4 questions for now are enough. I might come back to you if we still have time.
Can I just answer one more question, Stefan,
okay,
because
right.
it's very important. So Stefan asked a very good question, and it's unfortunately the last slide that we skipped. He says that he feels that there is a bias in the methodology. Some words might be linked to specifics of a case, for instance, integration for selective distribution. Therefore, the number of hits might depend on which cases are dealt with. This is fair, correct? It is the difference between us counting all of the instances that we found count as so-called no-yes, and then from that list of results, we only count then as yes. So narrowly speaking, the ones that we felt that actually do discuss a goal or a purpose of competition law, not simply because it appears in the wording of, say, a treaty. So for example, 101 says distortion, so therefore theoretically we should have counted every 101 case. So we did and we didn't. We counted it as in the overall results, but when we excluded all the felt that it's not an actual discussion of the competition goal, but it's rather because it is simply mentioned in the text of the treaty or the nature of the case. The rest I'll just pipe them in. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, let me turn to Juha.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the questions. I'll start from Jasper's question because that leads me to George's question quite nicely. So Jasper asked if sustainability should be factored into antitrust analysis more because of the urgency of sustainability. And I would answer the question as follows. So first of all, I think it's justified to consider sustainability in a public policy because it's an existential question, and if we only focus on economic aspects, there are also justifications for taking that into account. But the real challenge is how to do that. And the kind of first choice is whether antitrust is a good tool or whether that should be done with other tools. So for instance, a carbon tax might be a much more effective solution than dealing with the problem in antitrust. So kind of the role of antitrust depends on what kind of niche is left from other regulation. So if other regulation works well, we don't maybe need to consider it in antitrust. But the reality might be that the public regulation, for various political reasons and other reasons, doesn't address sustainability effective. And in that kind of scope, there is kind of room for antitrust to contribute to sustainability. And more specifically in antitrust, it then becomes a question of how to do that. And as I mentioned, these sustainability benefits are a bit uncertain. And the risk is that if we just accept them a bit naively, we might accept things that are actually harmful to both competition and sustainability. And that's my concern. But that leads me to George's question about the time frames of antitrust assessment as well as kind of sustainability assessments. So one of my major concerns is that kind of short-term sustainability fixes that have anti-competitive aspects might have harmful effects on kind of the structural change of markets and industries and on innovation. So the anti-competitive effects can exceed, can be kind of on the long run be quite detrimental to sustainability. So for that reason, I would kind of expand the antitrust horizon a bit to take that into account, kind of in the way we do with the tests under Article 101 and maybe 102, that we don't accept deficiencies if there's kind of complete elimination of competition. And yeah, that's pretty much what I had in mind. If you have more questions, I'm of course happy to answer them.
Okay, looking at the time, I'm just going to move on to the next speaker. So Dina, do you want to respond to some of the points that were raised?
Yes, so I'll address first your question, Giorgio. So the way I distinguish between developing and developed countries, I took a World Bank classification per GDP. So I just aligned to their classification of GDP per capita. So high income was developed, and then medium and low income were my developing countries. The other two questions, I think they're very similar. So both yours, first Jasper's question about my my intuition of why there is no U-shaped in the developed world. I think I said that very quickly at the end of my talk, is that I think that it's a matter of development. So it's the typical assumption of developing countries need to build up their infant industries. They need to be able to compete in international markets. Their companies are too small to be able to be pushed towards more competition. So they need a certain level of protection. at a certain point in their development. So not initially. So initially, and that's why the first part is an increasing part, is that initially we need to break up the ownership of the means of production of the companies into several companies, not hundreds, but tens. But then after they're 10, these 10 need to be strong enough so that they can compete internationally, that they can even satisfy the local demand that is often not very strong given poverty and so on. And then once this becomes stronger, then so that explains why in the developed world you don't have that, because these companies are already, or these countries are already on a track of development that does not necessitate a part that's sort of an infant industry protection argument. So this is how I see the negative part of the curve in the developing countries that obviously doesn't exist in the developed world because exactly of that reason. The other two questions, I'll group them, both yours, Giorgio, and Ramzi's question, that I think are great questions. The others were great questions too, but these questions are particularly difficult to answer because you're both asking me if I distinguish between monopolies that were generated through an industrial policy, legal barriers, state support, or just monopolies that happen to become monopolies. And the data doesn't distinguish that. So one way to maybe answer that is that I say I look at the manufacturing industries, but that doesn't answer the question because many of these manufacturing industries were industries that were protected by the state, part of an industrial policy. But maybe a way out of this question is it doesn't really change much. So it doesn't change much of whether these companies and these businesses were state-run industries or state-protected industries. The fact that that's how the curve looks like just makes us realize that at one point we need the state to make sure that these industries are not going to be pushed towards a competitive structure that doesn't allow them to innovate and to grow and to provide the necessary growth potential that they could achieve. And that, I don't discuss it in that paper, but in other work that I've done, is that at one point, once we realize that, so in no way is that to say that monopolies are good in the developing world, it's just to say that the state needs to be involved. First of all, it needs to be involved to separate the sheep from the goat, but then once it has done the separation, then maybe there's an extra layer of regulation, price regulation, rate regulation that needs to come to make sure that these monopolies do not abuse these whatever protected position that have been granted in order to facilitate a certain perception of innovation and growth, which is what the data here shows. That's it.
Thank you very much. Theodosia?
Yes, thank you for the questions, all of you. So the first question is, why should universities actually be allowed to boycott the ranks? And yeah, this is a plausible question, but the issue is that the US News ranks actually have created a prisoner dilemma, which means that it's universities that plays the game actually will have a higher rank, but all universities will be worse off if they defer to the ranks, because as I said, the ranks incentivize universities to engage in socially wasteful investments, but also to compromise diversity, an important dimension of educational quality. Therefore, the question that I try to raise in my paper is if collection action actually is needed so that these negative impacts are going to be reduced. And this is also linked with Georgia's question, whether there are at least restrictive means to which these goals, the promotion of equality of opportunity and quality, can actually be ensured. And also, this is a very plausible question, and I analyzed this issue more in my paper, but I didn't have the time to speak about this a lot in my presentation. And I would like to say two things. First, that if the universities actually cooperated and started a discussion with the US News magazine, how they should create a new ranking system, I believe that still there should be some antitrust risk. And this is because the universities should actually have to agree on the dimensions of quality they actually want to compete. So this raises also some antitrust concerns, I believe. The same would happen if they created a joint venture in order to create their own ranking system. Also, another issue that my research shows is that whenever the universities individually try to start a conversation with the editors of the US News magazine, the editors actually say that it's not our role to ensure equality of opportunity. Our role is to create a ranking system that sells. So we're going to explain you how you're going to play better the game so that you're going to have a higher rank. So university leaders say, this is what a research study that was published by Politico says, that the university leaders actually are a bit disappointed that the US news drugs do not really take into account their own considerations. The third question is how competition authorities may adapt an alternative, more inclusive welfare standard when they examine this type of agreements. I think that, as I said in my presentation, one way they could do it is by adapting, is by integrating distributive concerns into their assessment. For example, they could say that an agreement, a boycott actually between competitors, and an agreement that would promote the interests of lower income students actually will benefit more the lower income students, of course, than the rich students. This is because lower income students would receive, for example, more scholarships on the basis of needs, or they would have higher chances to gain access to elite education because they would face lower barriers to entry. Therefore, competition authorities could actually say that the interests of the lower income students weigh more than the interests of the richer students, because quality of opportunity is a goal that we want to pursue, especially when higher education is at stake. And of course, this task is very challenging for competition authorities. Health authorities do this type of assessment when they decide how to allocate their healthcare resources. So they take into account the socioeconomic status of different groups. And I do not say that competition authorities have necessarily the tools to do this stuff, this task, but I think that they have good reason to think about it when the goal of equality of opportunity is at stake. And the last question is how much competition we actually need in order to improve equality. The answer is that I do not say that we don't need competition in the higher education sector in order to promote quality. I just say that universities should actually compete on wider dimensions of quality, and diversity should be one of them. So universities, of course, should compete, but should compete on the right dimensions of quality and the dimension that also reflect higher education objectives, such as equality of opportunity and diversity. So a ranking system that would actually incentivize universities to compete on wider dimensions then would also promote the goal of equality of opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. And then I turn to Ramsey to wrap up.
Okay, so Anna asked, sort of, does the analogy have limitations because, consumers aren't as stuck, as we all are with respect to individual firms, as we all are with respect to our governments. And I think that's a great point that, security is the most important thing, right? It's a difference between life and death. And so, of course, we would expect that, we would be interested in a kind of governance regime for the force monopoly in a way that we might not be for other monopolies. I think that's certainly right. On the other hand, if the claims about the tech giants that are being made are accurate, and I'm not convinced that they are, but if Amazon is this potential monopoly that will swallow all of retail, obviously, that some of the same considerations, and same inability to exit starts to come up. And that's indeed what antitrust law is all about, right? The bigger the firm, the less ability to exit, the more we want to worry about it from an antitrust perspective. But I certainly agree there's a sliding scale. Shilpi says, well, isn't governance easier because you can have transparency in governance with governments that you can't have with respect to tech platforms? And I think that's right. However, if we're really arguing that these platforms are monopolies, then competitiveness is obviously going to be less of a concern with respect to secretiveness, right? I mean, if they're not going anywhere, we can afford to require more transparency on their part as well. Wendy points out that, this idea of antitrust not being the same thing as constitutional law doesn't really map all that well into the EU context, which I think is right. I mean, it's part of the sort of EU equivalent of the Constitution has got antitrust in there. But I think the underlying conceptual exercise still applies, which is, all governments, regardless where you put antitrust, all governments have these separate rules that say no slavery, right? No integration between the forced monopoly and labor. Most governments, have private markets to some extent, in which you basically have a separation between the forced monopoly and the other means of production. So the thought experiment still works, even if you change the labels. And Giorgio makes an excellent point. Made an excellent point to me privately. Saying, well, is the analogy here that we want to have governance, or maybe what we learned from this is simply that actually we want to disintegrate the platform from Amazon as the platform from competing on the platform. So maybe actually this exercise supports the Elizabeth Warren proposal. And that's because I left something out of my argument, which is, right, the forced monopoly is the platform here, right? We're operating in government on the platform, which is the security that government provides us. But government sometimes provides some services, right? Roads are built by the government, for example. So we have some kind of competition on our own platform within this analogy. And what we've learned is that we use governance to decide when it's okay and when it's not, right? And so that's my point, is that this tech platform issue is much more subtle than just blanket rule, no competing on your own platform. And that's why the governance thing comes up. I think I'm out of time, so I won't, I'll stop there.
Well, that's great. So at this point, all 60 people would clap sonorously and you'd all feel satisfied. So you'll have to do with a virtual applause for now. Thank you very much to the speakers and to the many excellent comments that came out in the chat. So the room stays open for another 10 minutes. If anybody wants to ask a question, either raise your hand if I can see it, or just unmute your mic and ask a question to one of the speakers.